The crisp autumn air carried the faint smell of smoke as the five friends hiked deep into the woods outside the small town of Willow Creek. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and they decided to ditch family dinners for a camping trip in the wild. The group, Anne, Jake, Sarah, Eric, and Mia, had heard whispers about the area, about how the woods were cursed by the souls of the pilgrims buried there centuries ago, but they laughed it off. Just old ghost stories, Jake said, leading the way with a flashlight. People love to make up stuff about graveyards. Still, the idea of setting up a camp near the so-called pilgrim graves added an edge of excitement to their trip. It wasn't every day you could say you slept next to history. By the time they found the graves, the sun was setting. There were no headstones, just uneven mounds of dirt, marked by weathered wooden crosses. A rusty plaque nearby read, "Here lies the first settlers of Mill Creek. May they rest in peace." "This is creepy," Sarah said, shivering as the shadows stretched over the site. "Creepy but cool," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "We gotta get some pictures for the gram." "Maybe we shouldn't mess with it," Mia said quietly. She was the most cautious of the group, always sensing when something wasn't right. "It's fine," Jake said, ignoring her. He stepped over one of the mounds and snapped a selfie. The others joined in. Their laughter echoed through the trees. Anne tripped over a root and fell onto one of the graves, landing hard. "Oh, that's great," she muttered, brushing dirt off her jeans. She froze when she noticed the ground beneath her was unusually soft. "Guys, check this out," she said, pushing her hand into the dirt. It slunk slightly like the earth was freshly dug. "That's weird," Eric said, kneeling next to her. "It's like it hadn't settled yet." Jake laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just, I don't know, the weather or something." Mia frowned. "These graves are centuries old. The dirt shouldn't feel fresh." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Jake waved it off. "Come on, let's set up camp before it gets dark." That night, the woods came alive with the sounds of snapping branches and rustling leaves. The friends hurtled around the campfire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows. "I can't stop thinking about those graves," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't start," Jake groaned, tossing a stick into the fire. "She's right," Sarah said. "What if we disturb something? What if—" A loud snap cut her off. They all turned toward the sound, flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Probably just an animal," Eric said, though his voice was shaky. "Yeah," Anna agreed, but her eyes darted nervously toward the shadows. Then came a low, guttural groan. It didn't sound like an animal. It was deep and wet, like something trying to speak through waterlogged lungs. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jake said, but his confidence was fading. The groan came again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around them. "Pack up," Mia said, standing. "We're leaving now." "No way," Jake said. "We're in the middle of the woods. It's dangerous to hike back at night." "More dangerous than staying here," Mia shot back. Before they could argue further, the earth beneath their campsite shifted. A mound of dirt near the graves began to move, collapsing inward as if something underneath was stirring. The friends froze, staring in horror, as a skeletal hand crawled its way out of the grave. "Oh my God," Anna whispered, backing away. Another hand emerged, then another, until half-decayed figures began pulling themselves out the earth. Skin was rotted, their eyes hollow, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Run," Eric shouted. The group bolted into the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them the groans grew louder, joined by the sickening sound of dirt shifting and bones cracking. Mia led the way, her heart pounding as she glanced over her shoulder. The undead pilgrims moved faster than she expected, their twisted forms shambling through the trees with unnatural speed. "They're catching up," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "Keep going," Mia yelled. Jake tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground. One of the creatures was on him in seconds, its bony fingers wrapping around his ankle. He screamed, kicking wildly, but its grip was like iron. "Help me," he shouted. Eric and Anne grabbed his arms, pulling him free just as the creature lunged for his throat. The group didn't stop to look back. They stumbled upon an old cabin, its windows shattered and its roof sagging, and here, Mia said, throwing open the door. Friends piled inside, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a rotting table. The groans and shuffling grew closer, the sound of the undead closing in. What do we do? Anna cried, tears streaming down her face. We have to fight, Eric said, grabbing a rusted fire poker from the corner. With what? Sarah snapped. We're trapped. A loud bang echoed through the cabin as one of the creatures drew itself against the door. The wood creaked and splintered under the force. They're getting in, Mia yelled. Another crash, and the door burst open. The undead poured in, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. Jake swung a broken chair leg at the nearest one. It barely flinched. The creature lunged, its decayed teeth sinking into his shoulder. He screamed as it dragged him to the ground. Mia grabbed a lantern and hurled it at another creature. Glass shattered, flames erupting and figuring the zombie. It withered and screeched, but more kept coming. They won't stop, Sarah cried. Upstairs, Eric shouted, pointing to a narrow staircase. They scrambled up the stairs, barricading themselves in a small attic. Groans and banging below grew louder as the creatures crawled at the walls, their hunger insatiable. We're not going to make it, Anna whispered, her voice trembling. Mia spotted an old journal on the floor, its leather cover worn and cracked. Flipping through it, she found a page written in sloppy handwriting. The pilgrim's curse binds them to the earth. Disturb their rest, and they will claim your soul as thanks. We disturb their graves, Mia said, her voice hollow. They think we owe them. What do we do? Eric asked desperately. Before Mia could answer, the attic door splintered. The creatures swarmed in, their glowing eyes locking onto the friends. Mia screamed as the first one grabbed her. The next morning, the woods were silent. The campsite was abandoned, the fire cold. The graves were undisturbed once more, the earth smooth and unbroken. The only sign of the friends was a rusty plaque, now bearing new words etched in jagged letters. They have given their thanks. Thanksgiving dinner at Kyle's family cabin was supposed to be simple, just a group of friends escaping the chaos of the holidays. Kyle, Emma, Tasha, and Liam had spent the day eating, laughing, and swapping jokes about who could eat the most pies. By the time the turkey was just bones, the fire crackled warmly, and the group felt stuffed and content. You know what we forgot, Kyle said, holding the turkey's carcass? The wishbone. It's tradition, right? Emma wrinkled her nose. You're actually going to dig through that mess? Kyle grinned, pulling the jagged wishbone from the remains. Absolutely. It's tradition. Who's going to make a wish? Liam asked, leaning back in his chair. Kyle waved the bone at them. Tasha, you're in. You're always lucky. Who wants to challenge her? Emma rolled her eyes. Fine, I'll do it. Let's get it over with. Two girls grabbed either end of the bones, laughing as they tried to outmaneuver each other. Make your wishes, Kyle said dramatically, and don't tell anyone or it won't come true. Emma closed her eyes, thinking of a simple wish. I wish we'd always stay friends. Tasha, however, thought bigger. I wish I could have everything I've ever wanted. With a loud snap, the bone broke. Tasha had the longer piece and smirked triumphantly. Looks like I won. Lucky as always, Liam teased, chucking a pillow at her. But as the laughter faded, the cabin seemed colder. The fire flickered oddly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Anyone else feel that? Emma asked, rubbing her arms. Feel what? Kyle said, but even he glanced at the window, where the frost seemed to spread unnaturally fast across the glass. At night, the friends went to bed, the uneasy lingering in the air. Emma woke up to a weird sound, soft whispers like voices just outside the cabin. She sat up, her heart pounding. From the bunk below, Tasha stirred. Did you hear that? Emma whispered. Tasha groaned. It's probably the wind. But as Emma listened, the whispers grew louder, turning into a low, guttural chant. Do you hear it now? Emma hissed. Tasha's eyes widened as the chanting seemed to come from all directions. Then came a sharp knock at the cabin door. They froze. Who the hell is knocking at this hour? Tasha whispered. Emma crept toward the window and peeked out. Nothing but the dark. snow-dusted woods. Another knock, harder this time, then the door creaked open on its own. Emma stumbled back as a cold wind blew through the cabin. Shadows spilled across the floor like liquid. Withering and twisting, the chanting grew louder. Kyle and Liam burst out of their rooms, both wide-eyed and terrified. "What's going on?" Kyle demanded. Before anyone could answer, the shadows gathered, forming a tall, gaunt figure. Its face was featureless except for hollow, glowing eyes. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed at Tasha. "You made a wish," it said, its voice echoing as if it came from the depths of a cave. Tasha backed away, shaking her head. "What are you talking about?" The creature tilted its head unnaturally slow. "A wish has a cost. All desires must be paid for." Emma grabbed Tasha's arm. "What did you wish for?" I didn't mean it," Tasha stuttered. "I just wished for everything I wanted." The creature's grin stretched unnaturally wide. "Then you shall have it." The lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness. When they came back on, Tasha was gone. "Tasha," Emma called, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" A blood-curdling scream echoed from outside. The friends rushed to the window and saw Tasha standing in the snow, surrounded by swirling shadows. Her face was frozen in terror as the darkness wrapped around her, pulling her into the woods. "We have to help her," Emma shouted, grabbing her coat. "Are you crazy?" Kyle said. "Did you see that thing? It's not human." "She's our friend," Emma yelled, vaulting for the door. The group plunged into the woods, the icy air biting at their faces. The whispers followed them, growing louder with every step. Found Tasha in a clearing, her body rigged as if paralyzed. Around her, the shadows solidified into monstrous forms, twisted skeletal figures with glowing eyes. "She wanted everything," the creature said, stepping forward. "Now she belongs to us." "No," Emma screamed, lunging at Tasha. The moment she touched her, a shock of cold shot through her body, and she was drawn backward. Liam swung a branch at the creature, but it shattered like glass against its body. The creature turned its hollow gaze on him. "Would you like to bargain?" "Leave us alone," Liam shouted. The creature tilted its head. "It's too late. The wish has been made. Payment is due." Ground beneath them began to split, jagged cracks spreading through the snow. From the depths, more figures crawled their way out, their skeletal hands reaching for the group. They ran, dodging the grasping hands. Kyle tripped and the creature grabbed his ankle, dragging him toward the pit. He screamed, clawing at the ground, but the shadows pulled him in. "Kyle," Emma cried, but Liam dragged her away. "We can't save him," he shouted. "We have to get out of here." They burst back into the clearing near the cabin, but the door was gone, replaced by solid frost-covered wood. The shadows closed in, circling them like predators. Emma turned to the creature. "You said wishes have a cost. What if I made another wish?" The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Another wish, another price." Emma glanced at Liam, then at the swirling darkness around them. "Fine, I wish we never made the first wish." The creature's laugh was cold and hollow. "A foolish wish." It raised a hand and the shadows surged forward. Emma gasped as she sat up, blinking in confusion. She was back at the table in the cabin, the wishbone still intact in Tasha's hand. The fire cracked warmly and the unease was gone. "Emma, you okay?" Kyle asked, frowning at her. "You spaced out." Emma stared at them, her heart racing. "It's nothing. Never mind." "All right," Tasha said, holding up the wishbone. "Let's do this. Make a wish." Emma grabbed her hand and yanked it away. "No!" Tasha looked at her, confused. "Why not?" Emma forced a smile. "Let's just skip it. No need to mess with tradition." As her friends laughed and moved on, Emma stared at the wishbone in Tasha's hand. She could still hear the whispers faintly like an echo just out of reach. She never told them what happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Wishes had consequences. The sun had dripped below the horizon as Mark tugged along the desolate country road. His car had broke down miles back, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere on Thanksgiving night. The chill in the air bit through his thin jacket and his stomach growled, a stark reminder that he hadn't eaten all day. He spotted a faint light in the distance, a flicker of hope in the otherwise dark landscape. As he drew closer, he saw a house, a quaint, old-fashioned farmhouse, glowing warmly against the backdrop of skeletal trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the golden light spilling from the windows looked inviting. Mark hesitated. Knocking on a stranger's door wasn't his style, but desperation won out. He walked up the creaky stairs and knocked. Moments later, the door opened, and a middle-aged woman with soft curls and a warm smile greeted him. "Well, hello there, stranger," she said, her voice sweet and melodic. "You look like you've been walking for miles. Come in, come in." "I don't want to impose," Mark began, but she waved him inside. "Nonsense, it's Thanksgiving, after all. No one should be alone on a night like this." Inside, the house was cozy and smelled of roasted turkey and spiced cider. A fire cracked in the hearth, and a long table was set with an extravagant Thanksgiving feast. Seated around the table were 3 other people, an older man with a bushy mustache, a young woman in a floral dress, and a teenage boy with dark, sullen eyes. They all turned to look at Mark, their faces lighting up with smiles. "This is my husband Harold," the woman said, gesturing to the older man. "And these are our children, Clara and Tommy, and I'm Edith, and you are?" "Mark," he said, still feeling awkward. "My car broke down a few miles back, and I was just hoping to call for a tow." "Oh no, phones are out here," Harold said, his voice gravelly. "Storm knocked lines out last week, but you're welcome to stay tonight." Mark hesitated, glancing at the feast. His hunger gnawed at him. "I really don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," Edith said, her smile unwavering. "Please have a seat. You must be starving." Mark's stomach growled loudly, betraying him. Reluctantly, he sat at the table. The meal was unlike anything he's ever tasted. The turkey was perfectly cooked, the stuffing rich and flavorful, the cranberry sauce sweet and tangy. Mark couldn't help himself. He ate plate after plate, his earlier reservations fading with each bite. The family chatted warmly, sharing stories and laughing, though Mark noticed that their laughter sometimes felt off, too loud, too forced. "So Mark," Claire asked, her voice soft, "do you have family waiting for you?" Mark shook his head. "No, it's just me this year." "How sad," Edith said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Thanksgiving is about being with your family. You're lucky we found you." Mark nodded, feeling a little uneasy. He realized the family hadn't eaten much themselves. In fact, they mostly watched him eat, their eyes gleaming strangely in the firelight. "I really appreciate this," Mark said, pushing back from the table, "but I should keep going. Maybe I can find help in the morning." "Nonsense," Harold said, his tone sharper than before. "It's a long walk to town, and you're safer here. Finish your pie." Mark looked down at the slice of pecan pie in front of him. Something about the way Harold said it made his stomach turn. "I think I'm full." Edith's smile faltered for the first time. "Oh, you mustn't waste food," she said, her voice unusually stern. "It's rude to refuse a hostess' generosity." The room seemed colder suddenly, the fire's warmth no longer reaching him. Mark forced a bite of pie into his mouth, the sweetness cooling. He couldn't shake the feeling that all their eyes were on him. "Excuse me," he said, standing abruptly. "I just need some air." Mark stepped outside, the icy wind cutting through his unease. He felt trapped like prey in a predator's den. Something about the family wasn't right. He walked around the side of the house, hoping to clear his head, when he noticed something strange. Behind the house was a small cemetery, its headstones barely visible in the moonlight. He moved closer, reading the inscriptions, his breath caught in his throat. Edith Walters, 1903 to 1954. Harold Walters, 1899 to 1954. Clara Walters, 1932 to 1954. Tommy Walters, 1940 to 1954. Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding. The dates didn't make sense. They were all dead. He turned to run, but a shadow loomed over him. "You found their little secret," Edith's voice said from behind. Mark spun around to see the family standing together, their faces no longer warm and inviting. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Their smiles stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You can't leave," Harold growled. "You're part of the family now." Mark bolted toward the woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The family didn't chase him on foot. They moved faster than humanly possible, their bodies flickering like shadows as they closed the distance. Edith's laughter echoed through the trees, chilling and hollow. Mark tripped, falling hard onto the frozen ground. He scrambled to his feet, but Tommy appeared in front of him, blocking his path. You shouldn't have left the table, the boy hissed. His voice was guttural, inhuman. Stay back, Mark shouted, grabbing a branch and swinging it wildly. It passed through Tommy's body, as if he was made of smoke. You can't hurt us, Claire said, stepping out from the shadows, but we can hurt you. Mark turned and ran again, his lungs burning, but the woods seemed endless. The laughter grew louder, surrounding him. He stumbled into a clearing, finding himself face to face with Edith. Her hands were skeletal now, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. You ate with us, she said, her voice low and menacing. Now you belong to us. Mark screamed as the shadows enveloped him. The next morning the house stood empty, its windows dark and lifeless. A passing hiker found Mark's car abandoned on the road. No one ever found Mark, or the strange family who had welcomed him into their home. The only clue was a single plate of untouched pie, sitting on the table in the dining room, waiting for the next traveler to accept the damned invitation. Maggie and Tom had planned the perfect Thanksgiving getaway, just the two of them in a remote cabin in the deep woods of New England. It was a chance to escape the city's noise and spend some quiet time together. The cabin was quaint, with creaky wooden floors and a stone fireplace. Outside the forest was still, the trees bare and the air sharp with cold. This is exactly what we needed, Maggie said, setting up the table with their feast. A roasted chicken set in the place of a turkey, alongside mashed potatoes, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. It was simple but perfect. Tom poked at the fire, coaxing the flames higher. Peace and quiet, no family drama, no Black Friday madness, just us. As they settled in for their meal, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Maggie froze, her fork halfway in her mouth. Who could that be? She whispered. No idea, Tom said, standing. We're miles from the nearest town. Another knock, louder this time. Tom moved to the door, hesitating. Maggie stood behind him, clutching her napkin like a lifeline. When he opened it, no one was there. Probably just the wind, Tom said. Though his voice wavered, he closed the door and locked it. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling they weren't alone. Later, as they cleaned up, strange noises began. A faint creaking came from the porch like footsteps on old wood. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing, he said, though his brow frowned, but I swear I heard someone. Maggie nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Let's just go to bed. Maybe it's an animal. Tom agreed, and they retreated to their bedroom. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, but the silence didn't last long. Maggie woke to the sound of whispering. At first she thought it was Tom, but he lay beside her, fast asleep. The whispers grew louder, the words garbled and impossible to understand. She shook Tom awake. Do you hear that? She whispered. He listened, his face tightening. The whispers were coming from outside the bedroom. Low and insistent, Tom grabbed a poker from the fireplace and crept toward the door. Maggie followed, clutching his arm. When he opened the door, the whispers stopped. But something else had changed. The air smelled of earth, damp and old. The living room was icy cold. The fire in the hearth, nothing but embers. And on the table where their Thanksgiving meal had been, lay a pile of bones, human bones. Maggie screamed, and the whispers returned louder this time, filled with anger. You owe us. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the cabin. Maggie clung to Tom as shadows began to shift on the walls, taking on twisted human-like forms. What do you want? Tom shouted, his voice cracking. What was taken must be repaid, the voice growled. Maggie's mind raced. Taken? We didn't take anything. The shadows swirled, coalescing into figures. They looked like settlers, pale, hollow-eyed, and dressed in tattered colonial clothing. One stepped forward, its skeletal hand pointing at Maggie. This land was theirs, blood spilled to claim it. You feast while we rot. Tom swung the fire poker at the figure, but it passed through him like smoke. The settler's empty eyes turned to him, and the cabin began to shake. The windows rattled, and the walls groaned as though they might collapse. We need to leave, Maggie cried, pulling Tom toward the door. They ran into the freezing night, but the forest wasn't the same. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching for them. The air thick with whispers, and the settlers' glowing eyes appeared in the shadows. "You can't escape," the voice boomed. The ground beneath them shifted, soft and loose like fresh dug earth. Maggie tripped, her hand sinking into the cold dirt. She screamed as a skeletal hand burst from the ground, grabbing her ankles. Tom yanked her free, and they stumbled forward, desperate to find the path, but the forest seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever. They finally reached the clearing, their breath visible in the icy air. In the center stood an old, crumbling monument, a stone slab, etched with faded writing. Maggie brushed the moss away and read aloud. "Here lie the settlers of Hollow Creek, taken by the land they could not tame. May their debt be repaid." And in that moment she realized, this cabin, this land, it's cursed. Tom shook his head. "That's ridiculous. We didn't do anything." "It doesn't matter," Maggie cried. "We're here. That's enough for them." The settlers appeared again around the clearing, and their hollow eyes glowing brighter. The leader stepped forward, its voice a guttural snare. "You feast on stolen soil. The debt must be paid in blood." Maggie and Tom backed away, their hearts pounding. "What do you want from us?" Maggie pleaded. "Your lives." Tom grabbed a rock and hurled it at the nearest figure. It passed through harmlessly, but the settlers didn't flinch. They moved closer, their skeletal hands outstretched. Maggie spotted an old knife laying at the base of the monument, its blade rusted but sharp enough. She grabbed it, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted. The settlers paused, their hollow eyes fixating on the knife. "It's a symbol," Maggie whispered. "It's from their time." Tom grabbed a branch and lit it with a lighter he always carried. The flames flickered weakly in the cold air, but the settlers recoiled slightly. "They're afraid of it," he said. "Fire and the knife, they're from their world." Maggie slashed at the air with the knife, while Tom swung the burning branch. Settlers hissed, their forms flickering like dying flames. "Get to the monument," Maggie shouted. "It's their anchor." Tom nodded, and they rushed to the stone. Maggie raised the knife high, plunging it into the center of the slab. The settlers let out an ear-piercing wail as the ground trembled violently. "Is it working?" Tom yelled. The settlers' forms began to disintegrate, their bodies turning to ash and blowing away in the wind. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When it was over, Maggie and Tom collapsed to the ground, trembling. The forest was still, no oppressive cold lifting. They stood there, breaths ragged, and made their way back to the cabin. It looked untouched, as if the nightmare had never happened. "Let's get out of here," Maggie said, her voice shaking. They packed their things and left before dawn, the weight of the settlers' warning heavy in their minds. As they drove away, the cabin stood silent and dark, but the stone monument remained untouched. And somewhere deep in the woods, settlers' whispers lingered, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest to wander into their cursed land. It would always demand the debt. In the small forgotten town of Willow Creek, Thanksgiving wasn't just a holiday, it was a tradition, steeped in whispers of the past. Every year, families gathered for a grand feast in their homes, but few dared to speak of the legend, the Last Supper. It started over a century ago when the Thompson family hosted the most lavish Thanksgiving dinner in town. Invitations were sent to everyone, but when the night came, none of the Thompsons were seen again. Their mansion sat eerily silent, the windows dark until a neighbor entered weeks later. What they found was horrifying. The entire family seated at the table, plates full of untouched food, their faces frozen in screams. The story became a myth, a ghost tale shared by candlelight. It was said that whoever dined alone on Thanksgiving night would be visited by the Thompsons and invited to join their eternal feast. This Thanksgiving, Sarah, a young artist new to Willow Creek, laughed off the warnings from her neighbors. She wasn't superstitious and planned to spend the evening working on her sketches. "The night alone will be perfect," she told herself. She picked up a pre-cooked turkey dinner from the store and returned to her small rented house on the outskirts of town. As the sun set, casting long shadows across her yard, Sarah set her plate on the table and lit a single candle. She took a bite of turkey, enjoying the quiet. But just as she reached for her wine glass, a sudden knock echoed from the front door. Her heart skipped. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she approached the door and peeked through the peephole. Nobody was there. She opened the door, but the street was empty, save for a chill wind that sent leaves swirling. Kids messing around, she muttered and shut the door. Returning to the table, she found her plate empty. The turkey, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone enter. The hairs on her neck pricked as a soft sound reached her ears, the faint clicking of silverware coming from the dining room. She turned slowly. Seated at her table were shadowy figures, faint but unmistakable. Their outlines flickered like candlelight, their faces pale and hollow. At the head of the table sat a man with sunken eyes and a rictus grin. He raised a glass as if to toast. "Join us," a raspy voice whispered, though none of their mouths moved. Sarah stumbled back, her pulse pounding. "This isn't real," she said, her voice trembling. The man at the head of the table stood, his grin widening unnaturally as he stepped toward her. Other figures followed, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes on tangled strings. Panicked, Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911. All she heard was static. The figures grew clearer, their features more defined. They were no longer shadows, but ghastly apparitions. Their flesh decayed, their eyes black pits. The man spoke again, his voice chilling. "One seat remains." A force pulled Sarah toward the table. She screamed, clawing at the doorway, but her body was no longer her own. Her legs moved against her will, dragging her to the vacant chair at the end of the table. The figures loomed closer, their laughter echoing in her ears like the creak of an old door. "Eat," they commanded in unison. Her plate, once empty, was now piled high with food. But it wasn't turkey or potatoes. It was raw, oozing flesh and bone. The smell made her gag, but her hands moved on their own. Lifting the fork to her mouth, she fought tears streaming down her face, but the bite went in. The room spun. Darkness enveloped her, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cozy dining room. She was seated in a grand decayed hall at a long table surrounded by the ghosts of the Thompsons. Their laughter was louder now, their faces grotesque marks of internal torment, and at the far end of the table, another empty chair appeared, waiting for the next lonely soul to dine on Thanksgiving night. Legend says, if you eat alone on Thanksgiving, beware of the knock at the door. The Thompsons might be waiting to make you part of their last supper.